The chair had a name on it, and the name wasn't there. I stood behind that curtain in dress blues I'd worn 100 times before medals catching the stage lights, and all I could think about was 6 inches of empty upholstery in the front row. 300 people were waiting for me to walk out and accept 30 years of my life folded into a ceremony. What none of them knew, what I barely let myself know, was that in less than an hour, a number would flash across a screen that would tear my family apart before it put it back together. $675,000. But that's not where this begins. My name is Rachel Morgan, and for 3 decades I wore the uniform of the United States Army. I stood backstage at Fort Liberty's main auditorium listening to the low hum of hundreds of voices settling into their seats, and I made myself breathe the way I'd trained young soldiers to breathe before their first jump. In, hold out. It didn't help much. Nothing helps much when the person you want most in the room isn't coming. The event coordinator, a young captain with an earpiece and a clipboard, leaned toward me. "Colonel Morgan, we're ready whenever you are." I nodded, smoothed the front of my jacket, and glanced one more time toward the double doors at the back of the hall. They stayed shut. On stage, the flags stood in their stands, crisp and still under the lights. A slideshow cycled through photographs of my career young Lieutenant Rachel, in fatigues too big for her frame. Colonel Rachel standing beside a supply convoy in the desert. Rachel shaking hands with generals whose names most people only read in textbooks. Old friends had flown in from 4 different states. Soldiers I'd commanded 20 years ago sat shoulder to shoulder with men and women I'd served with just last year. The front row was reserved for family. Every seat had a little printed card. One of them read Lauren Morgan, daughter. It was empty. I felt the ache of it low in my chest, the particular ache of expecting disappointment and getting it anyway. The captain touched my elbow gently. "Ma'am, would you like us to hold a few more minutes?" "No," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The people who needed to be here already are." It sounded composed. It was not. Beneath it sat 30 years of birthdays, missed on both sides of phone calls cut short by deployments of a daughter who had learned somewhere along the way that her mother's absence and then her mother's presence were both just things that happened to her, not things she had to show up for in return. The captain asked carefully if there was anyone else I'd like seated in the family section. I scanned the back of the hall, past the folding chairs and the coffee station, and found her Emily Hayes standing near a cluster of nurses from the Veterans Rehabilitation Center where she worked. She wore a simple blue dress, and she had the look of someone who didn't think she belonged anywhere near the front. "Emily," I called out. Heads turned. She startled, then walked toward me uncertain. "Your mother should have been sitting next to me today," I told her. "Would you sit there instead?" Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She nodded, and I watched her walk down that aisle and settle into the chair that still had my daughter's name printed on the little card taped to its back. Nobody moved to take the card down. I didn't ask them to. The ceremony went the way these ceremonies go, the speeches, the medals, the folded flag presented with 2 white-gloved hands. I kept my composure through all of it the way I'd kept my composure through worse. Near the end, Lieutenant General Thomas Whitaker, who had commanded me 20 years earlier, stepped to the podium with a look on his face I didn't recognize. Before we close, he said, "There's something even Colonel Morgan doesn't fully know." He spoke about a fund I'd quietly built over years, dollar by dollar, speech by speech, book royalty by book royalty. He said its first recipient had been chosen. He said her name. Emily Hayes. He said the number. $675,000. Emily went white. The room rose to its feet around her applause, rolling like weather through the hall, and I watched her hands shake as she pressed them to her mouth. I stood at the podium and felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with pride. 5 hours later, I sat alone in my quiet house, the medals still pinned to my jacket, my phone buzzing against the kitchen table over and over until I finally looked at it. 82 missed calls. Most of them were from my daughter. But that story didn't start with the money. It started the night before, with 6 words Lauren said to me on the phone, words I hadn't been able to stop hearing since. 3 months earlier, I got the letter that made it official. 30 years of service, and the Army wanted to mark it properly. I'd have been just as happy with a quiet dinner and a handshake, but the veterans organization I'd worked with for a decade insisted on something bigger, and honestly, so did the people who'd served under me. They wanted to talk about the deployments, the family support programs I'd built from nothing, the times I'd stood between a soldier and a decision that would have ruined him. They wanted to talk about the promotions I'd turned down so I wouldn't have to uproot Lauren again after her father died. I drove to Lauren and Jason's place myself to deliver the invitation in person. It felt important somehow to hand it to her rather than mail it. Their house sat in a nice development outside the city, the kind with matching mailboxes and a homeowners association newsletter. Lauren opened the door in workout clothes, hair pulled back, phone already in her hand. "Mom." She hugged me, genuinely happy to see me, and I let myself believe that was enough. I gave her the invitation. She read it over, tracing the embossed lettering with one finger. "Of course I'll be there," she said. "Front row, I promise." I believed her. I want to be honest about that. 30 years of disappointment hadn't taught me not to believe my own daughter, and maybe that says more about me than about her. The night before the ceremony, my phone rang. Lauren's voice came through bright, almost giddy, the way it used to sound when she was a teenager sneaking out to a party. She told me Jason had found a deal on a resort package in Cabo San Lucas, some limited-time thing through his work, and they were flying out first thing in the morning. "Tomorrow is my retirement ceremony," I said. I kept my voice even the way I'd learned to keep it even in rooms full of men who outranked me and didn't want to hear what I had to say. "I know," Lauren said, "but the trip's non-refundable. Jason already booked it." "What are you planning to do?" She laughed, a small, easy laugh that didn't understand yet what it was doing to me. "Mom, it's just a ceremony." A pause, then gentler, like she thought she was being kind. "You've been to like 100 of these things. I'll watch the video. We can do dinner next week, just the 2 of us." I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that my daughter hadn't just decided to miss an event. She had decided that 30 years of my life could be summarized in a video she might get around to watching. In the background, I heard Jason's voice, muffled but confident. "They'll understand. The Army does this stuff constantly." I didn't argue. Arguing has never gotten me anything but tired. "You two have fun," I said. There was a beat of silence on the line, like Lauren had braced for a fight that never came, and didn't quite know what to do with the space where it should have been. "Really, you're not mad?" "Go," I said, and I hung up before she could hear whatever was underneath my voice. I stood in my dark kitchen for a long time after that. On the counter sat a framed photograph of my husband, gone 8 years now, taken on a beach vacation we'd scraped together the money for when Lauren was small. I remembered something he used to say to me back when Lauren was a teenager, testing every boundary she could find. "You spend your whole career teaching other people how to take responsibility. Someday you're going to have to let our daughter learn it too." I hadn't understood it then. I understood it a little better standing in that kitchen alone with a ceremony waiting for me in the morning and an empty chair already reserved. I opened my contacts and found Emily's name without quite deciding to. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm the way it always was, like she was glad for any excuse to talk to me. I didn't explain much. I told her there'd be an empty seat at the ceremony tomorrow if she wanted it. She didn't ask how long the program would run. She didn't ask if it would be broadcast or whether there'd be anything in it for her. She just said without a beat of hesitation, "I'll be there." "You don't have to rearrange your whole day for this," I said, half meaning it, half hoping she'd say what she said next. "You've been there for every important day of my life," Emily said. I'm not going to miss yours. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was just true spoken plainly by someone who had never once made me ask twice. Two women, I thought. One who shared my blood and treated presence like an obligation she could reschedule. One who shared none of it and treated presence like the only currency that mattered. I didn't know yet how far that difference would carry us. I only knew lying awake that night that tomorrow was going to hurt in a way I couldn't quite name, and that somehow it was also going to be all right. People always ask what makes a friendship survive war, and I never have a clean answer. I only know that I met Susan Hayes at officer training when we were both too young to understand what we were signing up for, and something about her cut straight through my guardedness in a way almost nothing else ever has. I was quiet rigid, the kind of cadet who color-coded her notes. Susan was loud in the best way, quick with a joke unbothered by rank, somehow able to make a freezing night of field exercises feel bearable just by narrating it like a bad sitcom under her breath. We came up together through the ranks, different postings, different specialties, but we always found our way back to the same conversations. The exhaustion of training in the rain until your boots stopped feeling like your own. The strange loneliness of deployment, where you're surrounded by people every hour of the day and still ache for your own kitchen table. The particular guilt of missing a daughter's birthday over a satellite phone connection that cuts out right as she starts singing along to her own cake. Susan was the only person who understood that guilt without needing it explained. She carried the same one. I don't tell this part of the story often, and I'll keep it short because some memories don't need decoration to matter. We were on a logistics run in Afghanistan when our convoy was ambushed. An explosion flipped my vehicle onto its side. I was pinned my leg wrong, beneath me fuel already leaking somewhere I couldn't see. Susan came back for me under fire. She dragged me clear with a wounded shoulder and got me to safety before anyone else even knew what had happened. Later, when people called her a hero, she just shrugged it off. Rachel would have done the same for me, she said, like that settled it, like debts between people who love each other aren't really debts at all. I never stopped carrying that. Years after that, Susan was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, late stage, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't leave much room for negotiation. Emily was 18, about to start college, still young enough that the world hadn't finished breaking her heart even once. I sat with Susan more nights than I can count during those final months. Near the end, she took my hand, hers thin and cool by then, nothing like the hand that had once hauled me out of a burning vehicle, and she said something I've thought about nearly every day since. I don't need you to be her mother. I just need you to make sure she never thinks she has to get through this life alone. I promised her. After Susan died, Emily went into nursing. She worked through school, took shifts nobody wanted, refused every offer of cash I made because she didn't want to feel like a burden to anyone, least of all me. She could have taken a job at a private hospital and made real money. Instead, she went to work with veterans, the population everyone else seemed to forget once the parades were over. Quietly, I did what I could. I pointed her toward scholarships she didn't know existed. I helped her find a safe place to live her first year out of school. I stood at the edge of the crowd at her nursing school graduation clapping until my hands hurt. I was there the day she got her offer letter from the rehabilitation center. But I want to be clear because it matters. This was never one-sided. When my husband died, it was Emily who kept showing up at my door week after week, long after everyone else's casseroles had stopped coming. She brought groceries. She fixed the things around the house I couldn't manage alone. She drove me to the hospital after my knee surgery and sat in that waiting room for 6 hours without complaint. She called me every year on the anniversary of his death before I even had to ask her to remember it. She never did any of it because she owed me. She did it because she loved me. There's a difference, and once you've lived both sides of it, you never confuse the two again. As for the fund, the number that would later split my family wide open, it didn't come from nowhere, and it certainly wasn't built in a week out of spite. Over the years, I'd earned honorariums from leadership conferences I spoke at after my official duties ended. I'd published a book on military leadership and put the royalties aside. There was a small inheritance from my husband. And there were contributions, soldiers I'd served with, small businesses, people who believed in what I was building that had gone dollar by dollar into an independent non-profit I called the Service After Sacrifice Fund. Its purpose was simple support. The people who care for veterans fund recovery programs, offer scholarships to the children of service members who didn't come home and recognize the kind of service nobody puts on a resume. I only had the authority to nominate the first recipient. I'd nominated Emily months before any of this, before the retirement ceremony was even scheduled, before Lauren had ever mentioned Cabo San Lucas. I didn't know the fund had grown through matching donations to $675,000. That number wasn't a decision I made in anger. It had been building quietly the way most meaningful things do long before anyone was watching. The morning of the ceremony, Emily arrived early before most of the staff had even finished setting up chairs. She carried a small box wrapped simply no ribbon. Inside was Susan's old compass, restored the brass polished until it caught the light. Someone had engraved the back with a line I recognized instantly because I'd said it to Susan once a lifetime ago in a tent in the middle of nowhere. True leadership is knowing who never gets left behind. I had to turn away for a moment so Emily wouldn't see my face. Before I walked into the auditorium, my phone lit up with a notification. Lauren had posted something. I shouldn't have looked. I looked anyway. A photo of her and Jason at the airport, champagne glasses raised, both of them smiling the particular smile people save for cameras. The caption read, "Choosing memories over obligations." I locked the phone and didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say that a caption like that hadn't already said for her. The ceremony began the way these things do, formal and slow, and then the screen behind the stage lit up with 30 years compressed into images. Me as a young second lieutenant in a uniform too big for me. Me holding baby Lauren the day I came home from my first deployment, her tiny fist wrapped around my finger. My husband waiting at the airport gate, the same tired, hopeful look on his face every single time. Me standing beside soldiers who never made it home. The family support programs I'd built from nothing, one exhausted phone call at a time. Old colleagues took turns at the podium. One man told the room I'd once stayed on base through a blizzard so my junior officers could get home to their own families. A woman I'd served with described how I'd turned down a promotion in Europe so Lauren wouldn't have to change schools in the middle of grieving her father. Someone else mentioned almost in passing that I'd quietly paid for a fallen soldier's daughter to finish trade school, and had never told a soul until that moment. Through all of it, I never once heard anyone say I'd sought credit for any of it. That wasn't false modesty. I genuinely hadn't wanted it. The chair with Lauren's name stayed on camera longer than I expected. I watched the audience notice it the way people notice absence, the same way they notice a missing tooth, quietly then all at once. I didn't criticize her. I wouldn't give anyone that satisfaction, least of all myself. Sometimes I said into the microphone, "We don't get to choose who shares our blood, but we can recognize who chooses to show up." Then I told them about Susan, about the ambush, the vehicle, the shoulder she'd wrecked, pulling me free, about the promise I'd made her at the end, and the 10 years I'd spent quietly trying to keep it. "Emily doesn't replace my daughter," I said. "No one replaces a child." But today she filled a chair that indifference left empty. The room went very still. General Whitaker stepped up next and told them about the fund. He read from a letter I'd written years earlier, words I barely remembered writing. "The medals will sit in a box. The title will end. But an act of kindness can keep serving long after the uniform comes off." He announced the total $675,000 and named Emily as its first recipient. Not just personal funds, but an expanded package financial support for her directly, an expansion budget for the Veterans Center, where she worked a nursing scholarship fund long-term housing assistance for families like hers. Emily broke down completely. "I don't deserve this," she said, barely audible. "Don't measure yourself by one day," I told her. "Look at who you've become over 10 years. The room rose to its feet. Cameras caught all of it streamed live across the local network and the Veterans Organization's channels. Somewhere in an airport lounge or a resort check-in line in Cabo, Lauren and Jason were watching the same broadcast on a screen I couldn't see. I found out what happened next only because Lauren told me herself, days later, in a voice stripped of all its usual polish. Jason had turned to her phone in hand and said, "Your mom has $675,000 she never told us about." Lauren hadn't answered him. Not because she didn't have words, because the thing that gutted her wasn't the money at all. It was watching someone else sit in the chair with her name on it live in front of everyone who had ever known her. I drove home from the ceremony in silence, still in my dress blues, the medals heavier than I remembered them being that morning. My house felt different, walking into it that night, quieter but not peacefully so. I set my honor sword and the retirement medal on the shelf beside my husband's photograph the way I'd imagined doing for months, except I'd always imagined Lauren standing beside me when I did it. My phone had been buzzing in my bag the entire drive. I didn't check it until I was sitting in my own kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. Lauren, Jason, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, a local reporter asking for comment. People from my old units, people I hadn't heard from since retirement talk started. I turned the sound off and let it keep buzzing silently against the counter. 5 hours later, I finally looked at the screen. 82 missed calls. I didn't call everyone back. I called Lauren. She picked up before the first ring finished. "Why didn't you tell me about the money?" Her voice was tight high, the voice she used to use as a teenager when she'd been caught doing something and wanted to talk her way past it before I could ask the real question. "You never asked what the ceremony meant," I said. She told me they were already trying to change their flights, that they'd be back by morning. I told her there was no need. "You two already chose where you wanted to be," I said, and I meant it as fact not punishment, though I understood how it must have landed. "I know I messed up," Lauren said. "Messed up because you hurt me," I asked her, or because the whole country saw an empty chair. She didn't answer that. The silence told me more than words would have. Jason took the phone from her. He wanted to know why Emily, who wasn't family, was walking away with money that should have gone to Lauren. I kept my voice level, the way I'd learned to keep it level in rooms full of men convinced they already knew the answer. I explained that this wasn't an inheritance. It was a charitable fund built independently with a recipient chosen on the basis of years of service and care, not bloodline. Lauren hadn't lost anything that had ever belonged to her. Jason said I'd humiliated them on live television. "I didn't humiliate you," I told him. "I just stopped covering for the empty chair." They came home that same night. I heard the car in the driveway a little past 10 doors slamming harder than necessary, and then Jason was in my living room before I'd even set down my tea, his face flushed with the particular anger of a man who feels cheated out of something he'd already spent in his head. "You chose someone else's daughter over your own," he said. "No," I said. "I chose the person who showed up. Lauren chose not to." He accused me of using the money to punish them, of orchestrating the whole thing out of spite. I told him calmly that Emily's nomination had gone in months before the ceremony was even scheduled, long before Cabo San Lucas had entered anyone's plans. That silenced him for a moment, though I watched him search for another angle almost immediately. Lauren stood near the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, something shifting behind her eyes that I hadn't seen since she was a girl. Caught somewhere between wanting to defend herself and starting to understand she couldn't. I watched her realize slowly that this hadn't been revenge at all. It had simply been a spotlight turned on by accident that showed the distance between what she'd done and what Emily had done without either of them trying. I didn't ask them to leave. I wasn't interested in a scene, and I'd had enough of those for one lifetime. Instead, I walked into the storage closet off the hallway and came back carrying 3 old boxes, their cardboard soft at the corners, from years of being moved from one house to the next. I set them on the coffee table between us. "Sit down," I told my daughter. "There's some things in here you should probably have known a long time ago." The first box held paper. Nothing dramatic to look at, just receipts, bank statements, old tuition invoices gone yellow at the folds. I hadn't organized them for effect. I'd simply never thrown them away. Lauren lifted the top few pages and went still. There was the tuition bill from her sophomore year of college, the one she'd always believed her academic scholarship had covered in full. There was the down payment record for her first apartment, the one she thought her father's small savings account had paid for outright. There was an invoice from her wedding caterer marked, "Paid from an account she didn't recognize." There was a record of a loan quietly settled from the year she'd been between jobs, and too proud to ask me for help. And beneath all of it, a stack of therapy invoices from the year after her father died, invoices she'd assumed her insurance had absorbed. I thought she started and stopped. "You thought the scholarship covered it. You thought Dad's savings paid for the wedding. You thought Jason handled the loan." I kept my voice even. I wasn't trying to wound her. I was only trying finally to be honest. Parents don't keep receipts so they can collect on gratitude later. I kept them because someday you might need to know you never actually walked through any of it alone. The second box held photographs. Me as a young captain phone pressed to my ear in some overseas command post, calling home for a birthday I wasn't there to celebrate. Me arriving back in the middle of the night just in time to see her blow out candles the next morning. The letter of transfer to Europe I'd declined, still folded in its envelope, dated the same month her father died. Her father alone in our kitchen making pancakes for a 6-year-old while I was half a world away. Susan laughing, holding a toddler Lauren on her hip during one of the long stretches I'd been deployed. Lauren went quiet in a different way. Then not defensive silence, but the quiet of someone doing math she'd never had the numbers for before. She began to understand, maybe for the first time, that her mother's career hadn't been a parade of ceremonies and photo ops. It had been 30 years built out of missed, sleep-distance funerals for people she'd served beside, and the daily effort of trying to be a mother across time zones and deployments that didn't care what day her daughter's recital fell on. The third box held letters. Her father's handwriting unmistakable, addressed to Lauren, but never sent, tucked away for a day he must have known wouldn't come for him. One line stopped her cold. "Your mother will always tell you she's fine. Don't mistake her strength for not needing you." She cried then, not performatively, just quietly, the way people cry when something true finally lands. She admitted it out loud, haltingly. She'd always assumed her mother was simply strong, unbreakably, so needing nothing capable of absorbing any absence without consequence. She'd told herself there would always be another ceremony, another dinner, another chance to make it up later. Jason, still standing near the window, wasn't moved the same way. "Regardless," he said, arms crossed, $675,000 should have stayed in the family. Lauren looked at her husband for a long moment, and for the first time that night, something in her posture changed. "Emily acted more like family than we did," she said. Emily arrived not long after carrying a container of soup, having no idea Lauren and Jason were even there. She let herself in through the back the way she always did. She knew which cabinet held my tea. She knew where I kept my medication. She knew the back door stuck if you didn't lift the handle just right. She knew without being told that the following week was the anniversary of my husband's death. Lauren watched her move through my kitchen with the ease of someone who belonged there, and I saw the realization settle over her fully. Emily had simply been doing for years the things Lauren had always assumed someone else would handle. Jason grew louder, insisting everyone was trying to make him feel guilty for wanting what was rightfully theirs. Lauren asked him to go home without her. He looked at her like she'd struck him. "You're choosing them over your own husband." "No," she said, steady in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "I'm choosing to face what I actually did." He left. The door didn't slam this time, just closed quiet and final in its own way. Lauren stayed. There was no perfect apology that night, no speech that fixed 30 years in a single sentence. There was only a quiet meal shared among 3 women at my kitchen table, a mother, the daughter she'd raised, and the daughter of a promise she'd never broken. Real change rarely announces itself. It shows up quietly in the small, repeated choices nobody's filming. In the weeks that followed, Lauren started calling every morning not to check in on the fund or ask what people were saying about the ceremony, but just to talk about nothing about the weather, about whether I'd eaten breakfast. She didn't ask me to forgive her outright. She seemed to understand finally that forgiveness wasn't something you could request your way into. She started coming by on Sundays. We sorted through old photographs together, the ones from the second box, and this time she asked questions instead of assuming she already knew the answers. She drove me to my knee appointment without being asked. She started volunteering a few afternoons a month at the rehabilitation center where Emily worked, not for show, not for an audience, just quietly showing up the way Emily always had. Guilt usually fades in a few days. I told her one Sunday, watching her fold laundry she didn't have to fold. Consistency doesn't. She and Jason separated not long after. I want to be fair to both of them. Jason didn't force her onto that flight to Cabo, and Lauren never tried to pretend otherwise. "He didn't make me miss the ceremony," she told me once, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, turning a coffee mug slowly between her hands. I chose the easy thing. That was on me. Emily, for her part, didn't let the money change who she was. She used most of the gift exactly the way I'd hoped, though I never told her what to do with it. She expanded the mental health wing at the Veterans Center for women who'd served and come home carrying things nobody could see. She started a scholarship in Susan's name for nursing students who wanted to work with veterans instead of chasing higher salaries elsewhere. She funded a training program for nurses, specializing in trauma care for service members. She helped cover long-term costs for military families who couldn't otherwise afford them. She kept only a small portion for herself, enough to pay off her student loans, and buy a modest house not far from the center where she worked. Watching her build something lasting out of what she'd been given told me more than any speech could have that I'd chosen the right person to trust. A year later, the Service After Sacrifice Fund held its first annual award ceremony. I was invited back as founding honoree, a title that still felt strange in my mouth. I walked into that hall not knowing quite what to expect, and there in the front row sat my daughter. Early. Emily sat beside her, the two of them talking easily like people who'd chosen each other, rather than been forced into proximity by circumstance. The chair wasn't empty this time. Lauren stood when she saw me and crossed the room before I'd even reached my seat. "I got here early this time," she said, a small, hopeful smile pulling at her mouth. "I noticed," I told her. She hesitated, then asked the question I could see she'd been carrying all year. "Have you fully forgiven me?" "Forgiveness was never the hard part," I said. "Trust takes longer, but you're rebuilding it. I see that." I looked between the two of them that evening. My daughter born of my own body, and the daughter of a promise I'd made to a friend who never got to see how far that promise would travel. Different in every way, two people can be different, and yet both of them in their own time had become family in the truest sense. Not by blood alone, by choosing again and again to show up. The $675,000 never fixed my family. Money never does that it was never designed to. What brought my daughter back wasn't shame, and it wasn't the fear of losing an inheritance. It was the slow, hard-won understanding that love isn't proven by what you feel in a given moment. It's proven by where you choose to be when it costs you something to be there. So, if there's one thing I'd ask you to carry away from this, don't wait for an empty chair to say what you haven't said yourself. For the people who've spent their lives showing up for you, sometimes the greatest gift you can give them is simply arriving on time. I'd love to know where you think this story lands with you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.